to have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Tonight on Farage, Ben Wallace, the former Defence Secretary, says that membership of the ECHR makes us more vulnerable to terrorism. So isn't it about time we drew the logical conclusion and decided to leave? On a similar theme with this government, the FT reveals today that Rishi Sunak did know about the arrest of the China suspected spy earlier in the year and yet still went ahead trying to reset our relationship with Beijing. Are we getting our China policy all wrong? And Labour-controlled Wales on Sunday evening, in come the 20-mile-per-hour speed limits in virtually every town and village in Wales. And we'll debate both sides of this and see, does it really make any sense at all? But before all of that, let's get the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Nigel, thank you. Good evening to you. Well, the top story tonight is some breaking news that we've received that the value retail chain The Range has, we believe, struck a deal to buy their collapsed rival Wilko. The company's agreed to pay around £5 million for the brand's name and its website. And this sale could mean the Wilko name doesn't disappear from high streets for good, with their products in Range stores. 122 of the collapsed chain shops have already been sold to Poundland's owner Pepco and B&M. More than 10,000 Wilko workers are set to lose their jobs, although there is speculation they may be placed within the companies that have snapped up the remains of the chain. Now, in other news tonight, Tobias Ellwood has resigned as chair of the House of Commons Defence Committee over the so-called Taliban tourism video. In a clip posted online, he praised the Taliban government in Afghanistan. And GB News understands Mr Ellwood made the decision after an informal meeting where he was called in and asked to defend his comments. Well, in a statement this evening, the Bournemouth East MP says he got it wrong and that the video reflected poorly on the committee. GB News understands that the father, stepmother and uncle of Sarah Sharif will shortly be landing back in the UK to face questions over her death. Sarah's father and his partner fled the UK for Pakistan after the 10-year-old was found dead in the family home in Woking in Surrey on the 10th of August. We understand that flight should be landing at London Gatwick in the next 15 minutes or so. Surrey police saying they want to speak to Sarah's family about the little girl's death. And a man's been arrested after an 11-year-old girl and 2 men were injured by an American XL Bully crossbreed dog. And a warning if you're watching on television, it does contain graphic images. This next clip, footage emerging on social media of the dog chasing and attacking people in Birmingham at the weekend. West Midlands Police saying the 60-year-old has been arrested on suspicion of possessing a dog dangerously out of control. The former chief financial officer and 3 others from the collapsed bakery chain Patisserie Valerie have been charged with conspiracy to defraud. The Serious Fraud Office says it's charged Christopher Marsh and his wife, alongside a financial controller and a financial consultant, in relation with the offences. They're accused of conspiring to inflate the cash balance on the annual reports between 2015 and 2018. They'll appear at Westminster Magistrates Court next month. Now, the Chancellor says the government is sticking to its plan to halve inflation as the economy shrunk by 0.5% in July. But Jeremy Hunt explaining he remains confident about the future of the UK's economy, saying the country did recover quickly from COVID. And he pointed out it's also growing faster than countries like Germany or Italy in the long term. Labour says the economy's contraction, though, is a failing of the government. Those are your latest news stories. This is GB News. Across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio, and now on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. This is Britain's news channel.
Good evening. Ben Wallace was a highly regarded Defence Secretary. He really was. He commanded respect, I think, on both sides of the House of Commons. He has gone from that post. He's leaving Westminster as a Member of Parliament. Whether that's to do with a change to his constituency boundaries or he simply had enough, I don't know. But he now, of course, is free to speak out and to say what he really thinks. And I think what he said to the Telegraph overnight is really interesting. He said the European Convention on Human Rights has become a serious risk to national security and it's thwarting our efforts to stop terrorists. In fact, he said the whole thing was lunacy, that we cannot deal with suspects plotting against Britain from abroad, that we can kill them with drones, that's OK, or we can continue to leave them plotting. But what we couldn't do is what the Americans did when they finally took out Osama bin Laden. So he says that ECHR is a threat to our national security, that it leaves us more open to terrorism, and yet, when he's asked the question, should we leave, he does the classic Tory thing. Oh, no, it's absolutely dreadful, but we should stay. Feels to me rather like a rerun of the old Eurosceptics who said the EU is dreadful, but we must stay as members. I think the public are coming to a very different view on this, and I'm asking you, is it time to leave the ECHR? Farage at gbnews.com for your answers and responses, please. I'm joined in the studio by Mark Francois, Member of Parliament for the Conservatives for Rayleigh and Wickford, European Research Group Chairman, and, of course, ex-Army, somebody very concerned with defence, British forces. Tobias Ellwood, the chair until a few hours ago of the Defence Committee, made a pretty erratic statement, I thought, about the Taliban effectively stabilising Afghanistan and doing a good job. And he stood down as chair of that committee today, I suspect before committee members forced him out. Just get your reaction to that, please.
It was a difficult meeting, Nigel, I think for everybody. And it wouldn't be right for me to give you a sort of blow-by-blow account. I don't think that would be appropriate. I do think, though, Tobias has taken the right decision. To be fair, under his chairmanship, the committee, published some really hard-hitting reports about, things like equipment in the army. You know, you under his chairmanship, we really were having an impact. But because of this video, I think he felt in the end that he had to resign. The only thing I would add, because he's issued a statement...
So it's right that he's gone?
I think it was the right decision. He's issued a statement that stands on the record. The only thing I would add as a member of the committee is that we're all conscious, and I think Tobias is too, that video caused a great deal of angst, pain to veterans who fought in Afghan. It was a war, and we lost a lot of people, and we had many more who were very seriously wounded. And to them and to their families and their loved ones, we're all very sorry for any pain that this may have caused. And hopefully now we can begin to move forward. But we're all conscious of that, and I think, to be fair, so is Tobias.
OK. He got it wrong, he's gone, and in many ways, I think that's the right thing too. Mark, I mentioned a moment ago Ben Wallace, our former Defence Secretary, who, and I think I was right in what I said in the introduction, he did command respect, I think, from both sides of the House.
Correct.
You know, he was somebody who cared about the job, loved the job, actually was in the job for rather a long time.
The longest ever serving Tory Defence Secretary, I think.
Yeah, and you know, given that last year you had 5 education secretaries, it's quite nice to see some people that actually stay. But he's gone, and I suspect it's the change of his constituency boundary that's forcing him out of Parliament.
Well, at the end of the day, you have to ask Ben. But, I mean, he let me put it like this. I mean, I think he said in one interview that... Because, remember, he'd been the security minister for, was it 2 and a bit years before? He was Defence Sec for 4. And I think it summed it up very well. And he said, you know, when he went to bed at night, he had 3 phones by his bed. One was his personal mobile, one was his departmental mobile, and the other one was the top secret phone. And he told me a few days ago, even now, and when he gets out of a car, he sort of pats himself down, have I got all my... Even though he knows he hasn't got all the same phones. So he more than stood his watch. He was very widely regarded. It is true to say, if Ben had not been the Defence Secretary prior to the Russian invasion, because he saw it coming, call it a soldier's instinct, call it what you will, he sensed what was going to come. He took on the blob, he took on the Cabinet Office and the Foreign Office to get those NLAWs to the Ukrainians and to give them time to train on them. Remember, we've been training Ukrainians in Britain since 2014, a thing called Operation Orbital. If they had not had those NLAWs, but bearing in mind what we now know about the first 40,000...
And these are the weapons that were taking out the tanks?
Yeah, basically a sort of modern bazooka.
And in the defence of Kyiv, they were enormously effective.
If Ben had not forced the issue and made sure that the Ukrainians had those weapons, the Russians would be having dinner in Kyiv tonight. I believe that to be absolutely true.
That may well be true. But he's gone. And, yeah, in some ways, as you say, he more than did his bit. Enormously popular with the Tory faithful. He's gone, he's retiring, but he's now speaking out frankly. And, you know, this is quite strong stuff, Mark Francois. You know, I'm going to repeat it. It bears repetition. The ECHR has become a serious risk to national security and is thwarting our efforts to stop terrorists. And yet, your party seems to be utterly committed to continued membership of an organisation that is threatening our national security. Don't we need to do something about this?
I think we do.
Do you?
Yes. Nigel, I'm not going to insult your intelligence. You well know there are some people in the Tory cabinet who regard the ECHR as holy writ.
Yeah.
But I think events have evolved in such a way that we do need to revisit this. The boats issue, and Ben was making a separate point, but on the boats issue, what we should have done from the outset was what we did on prisoner voting, and we should have just said, thank you very much, this is none of your business. You're overreaching, is what we should have told the Strasbourg court. We are not going to accept your authority in this cross-channel scenario. We will do what we have to do to protect our borders.
Mark Francois, we didn't do it.
I know that, Nigel, but that's what I think we should have done.
No, listen, I won't disagree with that, and I'm sure most of our viewers won't disagree with that, but we didn't do it. You see, I'm getting back to this point. Ben Wallace is outlining the ECHR. I mean, he calls it lunacy. And yet, should we leave? Oh no, let's stay members of it. And it reminds me, as I say, of the old Tory Eurosceptics. Everything's dreadful about the European Union, but we should stay as members.
Well, not this Tory Eurosceptic, mate.
No, but no. But I mean, at the time you were Europe Minister, it's a long time back. The point I'm making is the party doesn't seem to have the courage of the logical conclusions that have been reached by, as you say, the longest-serving Conservative Defence Minister who's been involved in the war on terror, on counter-terrorism. And it's all well and good you sitting here and saying we should revisit it. What in God's name does that mean?
All right, look, you've basically got three positions. One, we continue as we are. The second position is that we say in certain areas we will delineated areas, we will no longer accept the authority of the Strasbourg court. And there's a precedent on prisoner voting.
I remember it very well.
Okay, and I think certainly in the boat scenario we should do that, and I think in some of the scenarios that Ben was outlining for reasons of national security, and as you say, he's a man who's got a right to have an opinion, we should do that too. And then if you like, the third option is that we leave the ECHR altogether.
Okay. Tell me why we should stay in.
Well, hang on, you didn't. I said there are three options.
You've just laid them out.
Right. So
why should we stay in? What are the benefits to staying in?
Well, I'm not saying we should. You didn't ask me that.
Well, I'm just about to.
Oh, OK.
What do you think we should do?
Well, speaking personally, to be very clear, speaking as Marc Francois, I would now, given the events of the last few years, given the boats, given what Ben has said about national security, I'm prepared to contemplate that we should leave.
To contemplate we should leave?
Yes.
Will this be in the Conservative manifesto?
I'm not in the government, Nigel.
Do you want it to be in the Conservative manifesto?
I would like it to be.
Would it be a referendum or something that... I mean, would it be a referendum vote or something that a majority Conservative government...
No, Nigel, I'm not going to sit here and make all that up off the cuff. I mean, you wouldn't...
Our people want to know.
Look, I think that the current position is unsustainable, right? The Prime Minister faithfully promised the British people he was going to stop the boats. Well, he hasn't stopped them yet, and everybody knows it.
Yep.
So we're going to have to do something different. I think we now need to have what you might call a national debate about the ECHR. And if the Strasbourg court continue to overreach their powers, then it may be that we have to leave.
All right. Marc Francois, thank you. They get there in the end. It takes them a very, very long time, but they get there in the end. We all know what Marc Francois really thinks. Of course we do. We all know what Ben Wallace really thinks. Of course we do. And I do expect there'll be something in the next Conservative manifesto. How sincere it'll be, I don't know, but I do suspect that it will be there. In a moment, we're going to talk about China. The FT today revealing that the Prime Minister knew full well about the suspected China spy that had been arrested, but still carried on with wanting to reset our relationship. And unbelievably, Kemi Badenoch saying 2 days ago that we have to maintain our relationship with China, otherwise we can't get to net zero. Dear, oh dear, oh dear. I need a break. See you in a minute.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Well, let's get some of your reactions to that debate on ECHR, prompted by our former Defence Secretary. One viewer says it is imperative that we leave the ECHR because we shouldn't have foreign judges in foreign countries having any jurisdiction over our sovereign decisions, especially regarding deportations and immigration. Michael says the ECHR is out of date and we should leave it immediately. Now that we are a sovereign state, we should have our own human rights charter, not bend to the knee of Europe. Well, viewers, I'm absolutely with you on this, and I think it's very like EU membership. It's one of those areas where I think Westminster is detached from where a very large chunk of the country are. Now, our attitudes towards China do seem to be at best confused. We learn from the FT today, it's confirmed that the arrest of a suspected spy was known to Rishi Sunak, yet he still pushed on, attempting to reset the relationship and indeed sent the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, to Beijing. Some would argue, of course, we should always maintain negotiations, even with people that we disagree. But it does seem that our policy, our foreign policy with China, is at very best confused. I'm joined by Austin Williams, journalist and author on China, and a visiting research fellow at the XJTLU University in China. And I managed to pronounce that without getting it wrong. Austin, welcome to the programme. Do you see why many of us are just utterly confused as to really what the British foreign policy position with China is?
Well, absolutely. I mean, obviously spying has gone on for a long time. I just saw on a rival channel that the Hong Kong Chinese have just revealed that there was a US spy operating within America for the last 30 years. You know, and the spy balloon, if we remember that from the beginning of the year, China flying over America. Yep. So there's always been this kind of to and fro. It used to be Russia, but now China's really come into the fray. So I do think that there is something about doing business with those countries with whom it's sensible to do business. And since China is one of the major business partners to the UK, how about 150 billion investment, I think, in the UK at the moment, then it would be foolish, I think, just to kind of withdraw or kind of bring down the Iron Curtain.
I do take your point on spying. We've all been spying on each other forever. In fact, we're rather good at it, I think. It's one of our great national...
Export industry, yeah.
Well, it's one of our national characteristics, that we are quite good at it. Although, spies at the heart of Parliament, obviously very worrying indeed. And yet, Austin, the reason that I feel so strongly about this and about whether we can really trust China is what's happened in Hong Kong. A very clear agreement, one country, two systems, a deal, a legally binding deal, international treaty till 2047, And they've just torn up the book, haven't they?
Yeah, but, you know, I mean, my starting point is that, you know, China is a one-party authoritarian state. What do you expect?
No, I'm sorry.
So I do think... So, I'm with you on...
I'm sorry.
I'm with
I
you.
don't buy that argument. You know, they may well be that, but we only handed Hong Kong back on the promise and the protection of people in Hong Kong up until 2047, and we see media magnets, big and small. We see pro-democracy groups being locked up in prison, forced to leave.
I'm a Democrat, and I'm not a supporter of the Chinese state, so we'll put that on the table. Second thing is that we do have to remember, I mean, I know this might not sound as if I'm playing fair, but generally when Britain left Hong Kong, it set up an entire industry of democratic, mandates and systems in order, in some ways, to embarrass China when they came in, because they would have to either dismantle them or carry it out on Britain's behalf. So, you know, Britain's rule in Hong Kong wasn't exactly the fairest, and Hong Kong police were fairly brutal. So, all that said, I completely agree with you. I mean, what's happening in Hong Kong is abysmal. The denial of all those kind of democratic rights which they have long enjoyed are now being taken away. That, you know, you can't walk down the street for fear of being kind of snatched and taken into Chinese mainland. So, I mean, all that is true. I do think it's an issue for the Hong Kong people to resolve. I don't know whether necessarily we have an ongoing liability other than bringing in Hong Kong refugees.
If they're allowed to, but if suppression's on the level that it is, it's very difficult for them,
of course.
I think, to express their collective voice. Extraordinary comments by Kemi Badenoch that we have to keep on doing lots of business with China to get to net zero, which I think means that we just export our manufacturing to China and the CO2 is produced there rather than here as they build 80 coal-fired power stations every year.
Well, that's the nature... sorry to interrupt you there. I mean, I do think that's the nature of net zero in some respects, this whole carbon trading, carbon credit scheme, which is effectively that a number of industrialized nations in the West are then saying to the developing world, and China is now a self-declared developing country, obviously, but, you know, when you're looking at Africa or parts of India, they're saying, you know, you don't need to develop, so give us your carbon credits to keep our industries running, and you can remain underdeveloped.
The whole thing's nuts.
Thanks, yeah.
We admitted China, you know, and the Americans made a decision on this, and we made a decision on this, and many other countries. We thought if we let China into the WTO, if we allow them into the global trading club, which we did, that somehow that would liberalise, democratise China, and yet actually isn't the truth of it that under this particular president in the last decade, they've gone in the opposite direction to that?
Well, they've gone in a fairly authoritarian manner, I agree with you, but so has the West. So you could argue that allowing them into WTO, they've actually managed to infiltrate on a much more subtle level the way that we are arguing. And we have an online safety bill, which is being pushed through Parliament, argued by the Lords as one of the most monitored societies in the world, and they were saying it in a positive way compared to China. The fact that we have, universities in this country which are blocking free speech, which are redacting literature. I mean, the Chinese government must be delighted to see this. No wonder they send 150,000 students over to us. So I do think that, we have to recognise that even though China is an authoritarian country, which is where I started this conversation, we're not far behind in actually learning some very bad lessons.
There are many things wrong here, cancel culture, etc., but I wouldn't compare the two. Austin, when you, as a visiting research fellow at this university in China, how free are you to speak when you go there?
Very. I mean, partly because I speak English, and therefore it's permissible. Because the Chinese state has got this kind of funny relationship with its own people, which is that obviously they don't want the natives to be revolting. And if you are saying radical things in English in a bourgeois Shanghai wine bar, they don't think it's a problem. Ironically, I think it's probably more of a problem than they give it credit for. But if you're saying it in Xinjiang province, for example, then the clampdown happens there because they think that the ordinary people are going to be the ones that actually start the uprising. So, they are very much monitoring speech. They're monitoring what people do and say, but there are certain groups within society. I've had more free and open conversations, I would argue, with ordinary Chinese people than I've had in this country.
But not with the Uyghurs?
I've had a few with Uyghurs, because it's a complicated topic. Maybe we don't want to go there, but because Uyghurs are all over the country. So, I mean, I have met several. But I do think that the clampdown on the Uyghurs is one of the great crimes of the century. I completely
OK, that is incredibly frank. And I'm fascinated that you're allowed to go back and forth from China if you express views like that. Final thought, what do you think, how should we set our foreign policy with China?
I kind of think we have to be cautious. So, you know, up until fairly recently, China was a major investor in our civil nuclear program, in our 5G technology.
Yeah, I know.
They are coming over to the AI conference in November. So I think there are certain kind of security issues which we would be sensible to have a view on. I think maybe kind of worrying about Chinese students coming to the country could be possibly if they're entering into those subject areas. But I think in general, Chinese people, in my humble opinion, in my experience, tend to be kind of very nice, ordinary people like everywhere else in the world. So we don't want to be kind of overly suspicious and increase the kind of a xenophobic approach to China. I think we need to kind of take as we find.
Austin Williams, thank you for joining us here on GB News. In a moment, closer to home, on Sunday night, the new driving terror comes to Wales with 20-mile-per-hour speed limits in virtually every town and village. We will have a passionate debate from both sides, live from Wales in just a moment. I think the whole thing's madness, but hey, in a moment, you'll hear both sides.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton, for 2 hours packed full of unfiltered opinions, unique takes and fiery debates. I guarantee you blockbuster guests and exclusive reporting with no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I think there is a culture of collusion, quite frankly.
And no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Yet another new driving terror comes in this Sunday. It's in Wales. It's the new 20-mile-an-hour limits. They'll be in virtually every town and village in Wales. There will be 1 or 2 exemptions, but the Welsh Government tells us it's to encourage more people to walk and cycle in our communities. It's to safeguard the environment. And I have to say, folks, you know, I don't particularly mind a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit at 8 o'clock in the morning, at 3:30 in the afternoon when the kids are coming out of school. the fact that we have it at sort of 2 o'clock in the morning strikes me as being completely and utterly mindless and ludicrous. And as for the arguments that it benefits the environment, well, actually a study from New Zealand suggested the opposite. But it is a big, strong, passionate issue. It's something that the Labour government in Wales seems to believe in. And who knows, maybe this is what a Labour government across the rest of the UK would do. Joining me to debate this imminent change is Andrew R.T. Davies, Welsh Conservative leader and member of the Welsh Parliament for South Wales Central, and Rod King, MBE, campaign director for 20's Plenty for Us. Gentlemen, let's begin with you, Andrew R.T. Davies. What are your main objections to this driving change that comes in on Sunday?
Well, it's the blanket nature of the changes that are coming in on Sunday, that it'll be the default position across the whole of Wales. I'm someone who actually in certain areas does support the 20's Plenty campaign. I've supported it in my own constituency, but I believe that should be in sensitive sites such as schools, hospitals and care homes, and not a default position that the Welsh Government, the Welsh Labour Government are bringing in on Sunday, that'll see it delivered across the whole of Wales. And ultimately, the polling is showing that 2/3 of the population here in Wales are against such a policy.
Well, yes, but they've got a Labour majority that have brought it in. Rod King, you know, there are many of us, Rod, who would say, and we all understand the dynamics of this, that if a car hits you at 20 miles an hour, as opposed to a car hitting you at 30 miles an hour, you know, you've got a 50% plus chance of surviving. And we all get that. None of us are arguing this shouldn't be right, this or speed bumps outside schools. But Rod King, tell me why this is appropriate at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Well, of course, that's like any speed limit. You could equally say exactly the same about any speed limit which you've got. So that's the end of really that particular question. One thing which we do know is that 20-mile-an-hour limits where people are, and I think we've got to remember that Andrew actually agrees with us on this. He's talking about 20 miles an hour for where there are schools, where there are houses, where there are high streets, where there are community centres, where there are hospitals, where there are churches. And you know, when we add all these places up, it's most places in our communities, in our towns and villages. And you know, in those places, that's where we put street lighting, so that the people walking around can actually both see, and with 20 miles an hour, they can be protected. And of course, there are some places where we have street lights, which people don't walk or cycle or don't live or aren't in those places. And that's where local authorities can set exceptions, because this is a default. And therefore, we have that national standard agreeing with what Andrew talks about, which is where there's communities, where there's houses, where there's schools.
Yeah, but Rod, common sense dictates. Common sense dictates that that's only at certain times of a day, and that actually 20 miles an hour is ludicrously slow at other times of a day. I mean, it is ridiculously, pitifully slow, isn't it?
I think most of the time, if you can go at 20 miles an hour, outside of those peak times, then you'll find you can get to most places within a urban or a village or a town environment fairly quickly at 20 miles an hour. Means you can get across a town which is 10 miles wide in about 15 minutes. So for most of our communities, that's really great. And as I said, we have 61 local authorities out of 133 in England have already set 20 mile an hour for most roads, with exceptions. What is really smart in Wales is that rather than have to individually set traffic regulation orders for all those streets, they can say, right, what was 30 will be a 30, but there can be exceptions exactly the same as there were before, where you had a default 30. And
those local authorities. Those local authorities in England that are going in the same direction, Andrew R.T. Davies, tend to be Labour-controlled authorities. Is this, in your view, the Labour Party's war on the car driver?
Well, Keir Starmer's on record as saying for what we would do in Westminster if we were to form a government, look to what we're doing in Wales. So I think the evidence speaks for itself when the leader of the Labour Party, who could potentially, if the people voted him in, be the next Prime Minister, would like to see this across the whole of the United Kingdom. But let's not forget also that there's the economic argument that the Welsh Labour government's own papers show that this potentially could have a cost implication to the Welsh economy of nearly £9 billion. The median figure that they use is £4.5 billion. In any consideration, that is a considerable sum of money. And let's not forget the minister who's driving this policy, the Deputy Minister for Transport, when he was the Deputy Minister for the Economy, said that when it came to the economy, he didn't know what he was doing. Those were his words, not mine. Now, none of us want to see another one casualty on our roads. We want safety on our roads. And that's why, in my opening remarks, I said that there are areas that 20 plenty is a sensible course of action, such as care homes, schools and hospitals and other sensitive sites. But having this blanket ban stretched across the whole of Wales come Sunday night is not the way forward and is not winning over people to sign up to this policy. But the government are forcing it on the people of Wales. And as of Sunday night, we will have that policy in place that will have a detrimental impact on the economy. And we've also seen bus operators withdrawing services because they cannot keep to the timetable because those services will take longer to do their routes. Those aren't my words. Those are the bus operators themselves highlight.
Rod, do you understand? Rod, do you understand why there are many of us, and we hate the ULEZ extension, we hate speed cameras, we hate the idea that we're becoming the most monitored, surveilled and fined country in the so-called free world. Do you understand that fundamental libertarian objection to this?
I can understand that objection to it, but I'm not involved in any of those things. And whether you want to object to those things is entirely up to you. What I'm talking about is the particular application of 20-mile-an-hour limits in the same places where Andrew wants them, those schools, those estates, those were high streets.
And everywhere else, and everywhere else. Villages will have this 20-mile-an-hour limit.
Absolutely. Time and time again, villagers say, we want 20-mile-an-hour limits in our village because it makes better to walk, more comfortable to live, it's quieter, it's just much more livable and friendly and fairer for everybody in that village, for the elderly, for children, for people who want to walk, people who want to cycle. It just makes those places better.
Well, yeah, an awful lot of people are going to get speeding tickets. I'm going to give a final short word to Andrew R.T. Davis.
We had a debate here in the Welsh Parliament today, tabled by the Welsh Conservatives, to try and stop this. Labour and Plaid voted it down. But importantly, the challenge was put to the Minister, was this the thin end of the wedge? And today it's 30 to 20. Tomorrow it'll be 40 to 30. And there will be an overall reduction across the board. Again, it's about the control that Labour want to assert in our private lives. And that is something that isn't a good feature for any government to be seen to be dictating to its people.
That is my big fear, aside from the merits. Gentlemen, thank you, both of you, for a very spirited debate on an issue that's live in Wales, but I suspect if we get a Labour government, we'll see it across the entirety of the country. And frankly, these days, when you're driving, just look at the Speedo. Spend your whole time looking at the Speedo. The whole thing, I think, is nuts. Now, the What the Farage moment. Oh, I love this. This is brilliant. So, the appointment of Thangam Debonair. I know, what an extraordinary name. Her appointment as the shadow sports minister is astonishing and says so much about the metropolitan elites from the big cities in our country, because she admits, as shadow sports minister, she's never been to a football or rugby game in her life. I mean, you simply couldn't make it up. Talk about detached from reality, but hey, you know, she might be, after the next election, the full minister. Now, I've got some really bad news now for the rejoiners. Those who have given us a diet of endless negativity about Brexit economically ever since the morning after that referendum result in 2016. You see, the Office of National Statistics revised the figures last week, which shows, far from us being the sick man of Europe, since Brexit, actually, we've outperformed in GDP terms once mighty countries like Germany. And astonishingly, UK manufacturing is now at the highest level it has ever been in the history of our country. And yes, I know there's so much the government could have done in terms of deregulation, in terms of encouraging business, things the Brexit freedoms gave us they haven't used. Yet despite all of that, we are doing okay. And Brexit has had no perceivable difference on the UK's growth. And a warning, quite extraordinary. The island of Lampedusa in Italy, in the last 24 hours, has received 100 migrant boats and 6,800 people. This is a major problem for Prime Minister Maloney, who was elected saying she'd do her best to stop the boats. It is all part of the EU lunacy launched in 2015, which I railed against in the European Parliament, where they set up their own policy, and it was very simple. If you arrive across the Med and land on EU soil, you can stay. And I said at the time millions would come, and indeed, I've been proved right. And what we get in the English Channel is the knock-on effect from it. Even though we voted Brexit, we're still, because of weak government, suffering from that knock-on. In a moment, wind energy is cheap. Let's build as many wind turbines as we can. Let's get rid of gas to back it up. We can have loads and loads of wonderful renewable energy, and it's going to be cheap as hell. In a moment, I'll challenge absolutely all of that.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Whenever I see consensus, I get nervous. Well, there's a very big political consensus around wind energy. Let's try for size. Ed Miliband in the June of this year. The Conservative ban on cheap, clean, onshore wind has cost families £180 on their energy bills every year since 2015. What about Sir Keir Starmer? Again, in June of this year. Well, he said £1,400 a year off energy bills for working families. Just imagine the difference that would make in a cost of living crisis. And we can go on to Alok Sharma, the Conservative, and he said a couple of years ago, the offshore wind sector is a major British success story, providing cheap, green electricity while supporting thousands of good quality jobs. And let's finish off with the great green convert himself, Boris Johnson, who said, I tell everybody who thinks hydrocarbons are the only answer and that we should get fracking and all that, that offshore wind is now the cheapest form of electricity in this country. There you are. Well, Clive Moffat, former government advisor on energy security and hot foot from a parliamentary committee today on this very subject, joins me. So if all the politicians are telling us that wind energy is cheap, that must be right, mustn't it?
I'm afraid not, no. If it was cheap, Nigel, then the developers would have bid into the auction and we wouldn't have had the very low bid on offshore wind.
This was the auction last week, wasn't it? For the,
Correct, yes.
For building new wind farms in the North Sea.
Yeah, it's been described as a disaster for offshore wind. And it seriously puts into question the government's target of moving from 14 gigawatts now of offshore wind to 50 gigawatts by 2030, which is only 7 years away. The real problem here is that the developers knew that the costs of offshore wind were rising sharply, and the government capped. Because the government was wary about locking consumers into ever-increasing subsidies, they were wary of creating a situation. So they created a cap price, and most of the developers turned around and said, well, you can't live with that. And the reason why they can't live with that is because costs have been rising. It's not just inflation. You've got to bear in mind that these so-called contracts for differences, which underpin the renewable energy auctions, are index-linked. So inflation isn't an issue. The issue, according to the developers, is the whole problem surrounding supply constraints, supply chain problems, costs of equipment, related costs associated with manufacture, the costs of capital, interest rates.
So basically, without some degree of government subsidy, new building of wind farms can't go ahead, can it?
Yes, I mean, today I was talking to some developers and there was talk of what we really needed. We needed another 50% increase in the strike price for offshore wind to even consider bidding. And
that would mean public money.
This would imply, in my view, depending on whether you think the electricity prices, this would imply a subsidy.
Yeah.
So you're talking here about, and this is the reason why government basically erred on the side of caution, is that they don't want to see an escalation in subsidies. Yeah. And the way the things are looking at the moment, most people are beginning to feel that, in fact, wind is no longer cheap.
Yeah.
Yes, and we're talking about strike prices, if they continue with the scheme as it is, approaching £100 per megawatt hour.
And of course, there are other costs too. There's the cost of new pylons, new infrastructure.
I want to come on to that. Second issue, not even talked about in the context of the auction, which only focuses around the strike price paid to developers for private investment to recover over a 15-year contract. What we are talking, the other one is the externality costs associated with wind, because the government is saying that by 2035 they want the electricity system to be gas-free. Well, that basically is not going to happen.
And the cost of that would be enormous.
It's mind-boggling, because you're talking about three elements here. First of all, we know wind is variable. And so there's a problem that, in fact, we may have 28 gigawatt of wind installed in the system, but over winter last year, there were several days when it only contributed 4% of electricity, which was less than coal at the time. So you've got this, what I call, you've got the intermittency problem to deal with, so that we have to compensate for that by giving out money to industry and consumers to cut back on demand at times of system stress. We've got to pay for emergency imports from Belgium or whatever. So there's that cost. On top of that, you've got one of the big issues that never gets discussed enough is the constraint costs. In other words, when wind is actually producing, but the system can't handle it.
So we pay them to turn off.
These, a few years back, this is about 500 million a year, which was considered to be reasonably acceptable given the level of wind in the system. But now, I've been told by a developer that they expect that these constraint costs could rise to well over £1.5 billion by 2025.
And let's just spell it out.
Now, the reason for that is because there isn't enough infrastructure. Just to finish the argument, Pettigrew, CEO of Grid, has said, well, to get the infrastructure aligned with this increase in wind, will require billions, if not significantly more than that. And we haven't got the time.
So we're, just to repeat, make it in good simple English, we pay wind farms not to produce electricity when the wind's blowing all around the United Kingdom.
We could end up with a situation, there are some of the offshore wind farm projects that have been paused because of the costs of the increases that have come through. And I think we could end up with this ridiculous situation if nothing is done to take a much more objective and rational, realistic view of this, where we have offshore stranded assets in more sense than one.
So, Clive, how do we... You know, I read out the quotes from all those senior politicians. How do we, and we all want a cleaner, greener world.
Well, nobody's going to agree with me about it.
No, but how do we get a proper rational debate on this?
Well, before the election, the answer is we won't.
Well,
because basically the government will insist that it's doing as much as it can, and Labour will criticise them for not doing enough.
Well, Clive, I'm going to keep getting you on this show, because a lot of people say to me, that bloke with the big hair who talks about energy, he talks a lot of sense, so we're going to...
We need this rational debate. We need a comprehensive, coherent transitional plan. 2035 is far too early to talk about taking gas off the electricity system.
I think that is right. Now, I have to give you a trigger warning that the next man who's going to appear on GB News is thought by some in the Metropolitan Police to be a far-right extremist. Jacob, I read that newspaper article about you this morning. I couldn't believe it.
Well, mild old me, I know. I mean, for one thing, when it's you, but when it's me...
Thank you.
That's what I'm going to be talking about. The thing is, it's not sinister, it's Keystone Cops. It's just so farcically ludicrous that they are wasting their time interviewing people and saying, you've had a selfie with that dangerous man. And
well, I'm always, you know, very cautious when people mention your name, obviously, but what on earth is going on?
It's really very strange, isn't it? But it's all of a piece. You have that ridiculous booby Lord MacDonald saying that everyone was in tears in the Foreign Office because we'd voted to leave. And then you say that people like me are frightfully dangerous. If that's all they've got to be worried about, they're not running the country very well, are they? They need to think of serious things.
I agree. It's going to be great fun. I'll be in the car listening to Jacob and his guests. And yes, I mean, you know, if Jacob's an extremist, well, goodness gracious me. State of the Nation coming up with Jacob in just a few minutes. Before that, let's get the all-important weather.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Alex Deacon here with your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. A three-way split with the weather tomorrow. Quite a blustery start across particularly northern Scotland. Many places dry with sunny spells, but across parts of northern England, North Wales staying fairly dull. Tonight it'll be wet and windy across much of Scotland and Northern Ireland thanks to this area of low pressure. The strongest winds across the Western Isles through the evening and then moving across northernmost parts of the mainland during the early hours. The rain will trickle its way into northern England and North Wales where it will linger for most of tomorrow, but further south stays largely dry. Still quite warm, temperatures holding up into the teens, but not the warmth and humidity that we had last week.
into Thursday, as I said, a bit of a three-way split, mostly fine in the south, mostly fine across Scotland and Northern Ireland, just a few showers in the west. It'll still be very windy early on, but this zone of cloud lingering from parts of Lincolnshire to Yorkshire, across through Lancashire and across North Wales will generate some outbreaks of rain on and off as well. Either side of that, in the sunny spells, feeling quite pleasant, but quite warm again in the south, 23, 24, further north, high teens generally. That zone of dull and damp weather has just shifted by Friday, so quite a grey, soggy day for southern Scotland and Northern Ireland. The far north, dry and bright bar the odd shower, and most of England and Wales set fair on Friday. Only one or two isolated showers in the afternoon. Cool where that rain persists, but turning warmer and more humid once more across the south.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Monday to Thursdays on